This isn't really a video I want to make, but recently the Pope has been receiving a tremendous amount of criticism, both from Catholics and non-Catholics, and so I wanted to make a quick video addressing what to do if the Pope is a heretic. And we as Catholics have to get this right. If we don't know how to defend and explain the papacy, if we don't honor and revere the Pope, then we're not any better than Protestants in a real sense. Nothing against our Protestant brothers and sisters. Here, I'm just trying to express that as Catholics, we believe we have the fullness of the truth, and so we need to hold ourselves to a higher standard. Too often, as Catholics, we can relish in the opportunity to say something bad about the Pope. Too often, we can be excited to share the latest gossip, the latest, did you hear that the Pope did this? We can be elated to have this juicy news that we can share with others so that we have the joy, the privilege of saying something exciting and adding a little bit of flair to the conversation. Too often, we are willing to engage in this gossip, this slanderous speech at the expense of our Holy Father. And let's say that the Pope has made some mistakes. Let's say. That's fine. So what? How does it benefit you or your neighbor's soul for you to relish in this? I see this all the time. People are so excited when the Pope does something controversial. The Pope does something slanderous. Oh, look at the views I'll get. Look at the camaraderie that I'll get. Look at the excitement that I'll get out of my audience or just my friends who I'm speaking to. This is not a Christian disposition. St. Gregory the Great, he's doing an exposition on the book of Genesis, specifically after the flood. What happens after the flood? Noah is intoxicated. One of his sons, Ham, finds him intoxicated and derides him, laughs at him because he's naked. The other two sons, they walk in backwards and they cover their father's nakedness with a blanket. St. Gregory the Great says that you and I need to be like Shem and Japheth. We need to do everything we can to cover our father's nakedness. And this specifically applies to piety, trying to cover up for our father's deficiencies and weaknesses, etc., etc. I'm not saying there's never a time to call out the Pope when he does something bad. I'm not saying that. I'm not saying the Pope is so infallible that he can't make any mistakes about his administration or any mistakes in just his day-to-day interviews or things like this. I'm not saying the Pope hasn't been a source of scandal for people. I'm not saying any of these things. I think that all of this can be done in a way that's productive and honest and holy. But whenever we criticize the Pope, if there is a due cause, we want to do it for the benefit of our neighbor and for the greater glory of God. If there's a due cause, we need to do it with carefulness and with reverence, not for the sake of exciting news, not for the sake of flamboyancy, not for the sake of whatever these people are doing online. We need to do it with a gentle and pious heart. To give you an example from the scriptures, Saul is anointed king. Then David kills Goliath. And they chant, David has killed his 10,000s, Saul his thousands. From that day on, Saul hates David. He tries to stab him through and spear him to a wall 3 times. And David escapes. David has Saul in his clutches twice. Twice he cuts off the hem of his robe once to prove that David was in his hand. The Lord handed Saul over into David's hand. And Saul comes out. David has the hem of his garment. He says, look, I mean you no harm. I will not strike the Lord's anointed. And then a second time, David sneaks into Saul's camp. And he's right there with Saul, who's sleeping. He could kill Saul instantly. He could strike Saul and it would all be over. And one of David's friends, he says to him, take his life. The Lord has given him into your hand. And David says, the Lord will strike him. I will not strike him. And they take a water pot and a spear from the king. They go outside the camp. Once again, David says, look, I've taken this from you. The Lord gave you into my hand and I would not strike you. I mean you no harm. This is the model, the biblical model for how we should treat those in authority against us. And this is what separates us from Protestants in a very real way. Catholics look at the abuse of authority and realize that I will not strike the Lord's anointed. This is what makes us faithful Catholics. Once again, I am not saying, do not hear what I'm not saying. I am not saying we have to roll over and take everything that comes out of the Vatican and we just have to submit to everything with shutting our intellects off. That is not what I'm saying. What I am saying is we need to be faithful to the office of the papacy, even if the one who is holding it is not a good man. Just as David was faithful to King Saul. He's as faithful as you possibly can be in his circumstances. Faithful to the Lord's anointed, knowing that God himself will strike down Saul whenever the time comes. Vengeance belongs to the Lord. It doesn't belong to me, doesn't belong to any of these personalities online, and it doesn't belong to you in your conversations with your friends. To the degree that it's possible and reasonable, you should try to cover up the faults of others, especially the Holy Father. Not just the Holy Father, but especially the Holy Father. There's a sin called detraction. Detraction. Christians fall into this so often. It's where you hurt somebody's reputation without due cause by telling the truth. It's a sin called detraction. Even if what you're saying about the Pope is true, if you're damaging his reputation without a grave cause, without a due cause, something that justifies you damaging his reputation, it is a sin. Every man has a right to his good reputation. And just like you wouldn't want your friends going around and telling all the mistakes that you made, even though they're true, you don't want that. That damages your reputation. It's not fair to you. You don't want others to do that to you. You should not do it to others, even if they're public figures. So we need to be very careful in our language about the Holy Father. The fourth commandment says, honor your father and mother. That includes the Holy Father, Pope Leo. Okay, so where do we go with this and what's the point? The point is this. It's not that you should never disagree with the Pope, never criticize the Pope, but whenever you do these things, it should be done in such a way where you're lamenting the fact that you're put in this position and you're reluctantly sharing this information and why you disagree. It should never be the case that you are relishing or excited or just so willing to strike the Lord's anointed. You and I quite probably will never have the opportunity to be ready to strike the Pope in any way. However, we can strike the Holy Father with our tongues. We can strike the Holy Father by damaging his reputation. And same for the bishops and same for the priests. We will be judged for every word that we utter. Matthew chapter 12, Jesus says, by your words you will be justified. By your words you will be condemned. And if we're using our words to detract, to tear down, to damage the reputations of our superiors, of the Lord's anointed, of the bishops and the Pope that God himself has appointed, then we will be judged harshly. Because listen, maybe you love Pope Leo, maybe you hate Pope Leo. The point is, he is the Pope. The Holy Spirit is guiding the church, and Pope Leo is in a very real way the Lord's anointed. Even if, I'm not saying this is the case, but even if Pope Leo is a nefarious and wicked Pope, he is the Lord's anointed. And if we're going to resist the Lord's anointed, we need to resist the Lord's anointed the way that Holy David did, not by striking him down. David never attacks Saul or any of his troops. David, in fact, fights against the enemies of Saul. David, in fact, whenever Saul's territory is attacked, David avenges Saul's territory and ends up reclaiming that for Israel. So what can we do? We can fight with the Pope on pro-life issues, on Protestant doctrines, things like that. We can fight with the Pope to the degree that we prudently can. And on those things that we oppose him on, we should not strike out against him and seek his downfall, just as David did not strike the Lord's anointed. Rather, we should recognize his authority and resist him in piety the way that we would resist a father. Because in order for us to enact a judgment justly, we have to have a desire for justice. If you're doing the right thing for the wrong reasons, it's a bad action. You have to have a desire for justice. You have to have the authority to judge, and you have to do it prudently, within the bounds of prudence. For you and me, just normal lay people, if we're having conversations with our Catholic friends, having conversations with our Protestant friends, there's really no just cause for us to bring up these bad things about the Pope, for us to bring up our disagreements with the Pope. Now, if they bring it up and you have to defend yourself and try to defend the Catholic faith, that's a different thing. If the Pope comes to you and commands you to do something that's sinful in that present moment, that's a different thing, and you have different obligations. But generally, if you're just in conversations with your friends or you're making a YouTube video, there's no reason to bring up the Pope's failings and to try to broadcast them to others as much as possible. It makes the Catholic faith look bad to the heathens, to the Protestants, and it just makes you look bad because you're detracting. You're You're sinning against piety by hurting the Holy Father. The best thing to do if the Pope does something that you disagree with, if there's nothing you can do to change it, if you don't have a moral obligation to instruct your subordinates about the error that's going on here, if none of that's the case, the best thing you can do about the Pope's failings when they come, if they come, is simply remain silent and pray. Be like holy David, who would not strike the Lord's anointed. And if you want to see a video about a saint who followed an anti-pope for most of his life, then click on this video next. God bless.